Good afternoon and welcome to the Asheville City Council budget work session. This is our second work session so far this budget season, and we've got all of the City Council here on this work session. Work sessions are of course open to the public. We do not take public comment, but that's also because we don't vote on anything during work sessions. These are information sessions. And I am going to turn it over to our city manager, Deborah Campbell, to take it away.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon, everyone. As the mayor said, this is our second budget work session. And today, and Beth, I believe if you can pull up the presentation, we will be providing you with information about, next slide, please. Just recapping what we reviewed and discussed at our last budget work session. We're going to focus a lot on fees and the enterprise funds, and Tony will provide you with some information in terms of definitions for what we're calling enterprise funds. We're going to spend a lot of time on the water rates as well, and then bring you up to date on the American Rescue Plan. The purpose of these work sessions, though I want to just spend a minute on that, is really to provide you with background information, to provide you with information both about expenses, revenues, to essentially provide you with, I guess, as much information as we have about drivers as it relates to the budget, to enable you to deliberate, to have data and information about where we are currently in terms of our budget scenario, and potentially by, we hope, April or May, you all will have a good understanding of expenses, revenues, and then link those to your council priorities in terms of what you want to invest in over the next year or two. So with that, I will turn it over to our interim chief financial officer, Tony McDowell, who will provide you with information. I'd also like to note that toward almost the end of the conversation, a presentation when we were talking about the water rates, I believe we have consultants that will provide you with some additional information. So Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah, and good afternoon, Mayor and City Council. Welcome to the second of three scheduled budget work sessions. So thanks for the introduction, Deborah, and Beth, if you want to just move on to the next slide, I'll pick up there. Okay, so we always like to start off these presentations with some key takeaways for you all to keep in mind as we go through the slides, and we'll come back and reiterate these once again at the end. But for today's presentation, we have four key takeaways, and we're going to focus on talking about our enterprise funds. And as Deborah mentioned, I give you all a little definition of that. So enterprise funds are city operations that operate primarily like a private business. In other words, they charge a fee, and in some cases, they charge a fee that recovers 100% of their costs. In some cases, the fee doesn't recover all the costs, like in transit and the Civic Center, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But that's essentially what our enterprise funds are. And just to kind of compare the information we're going to share with you all today to what we shared last week or 2 weeks ago in regards to the general fund. At that time, we talked about how the general fund overall has luckily not been severely impacted so far because of the pandemic. The story is a little bit different in our enterprise funds. The pandemic has had a bit of an adverse impact on both operations, on the expense side, and the revenue budgets in the enterprise funds. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We're also going to spend some time talking about our fees and assessing fees for customer impact. Each year as a part of the budget process, we ask departments to look at their fees and bring forward any fees that they would like City Council to consider for adjustment in the upcoming fiscal year. And this year we're spending a great deal more time looking at those fees and really looking at them through an equity lens and how fee changes may impact our customers, and also thinking about the impact, the economic impact that COVID-19 has had on the community, and how additional fees or changes in fees may impact folks from that perspective as well. As Deborah mentioned, we're going to spend a little bit of time diving a little more deeply into the water fees and the water fee realignment that we're proposing that's needed to keep that system healthy financially moving forward. And we have our consultants from DEC and Associates, Doug and Andrew Carter, here with us today to provide you all with a little more information about the water fees. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan. And it's very early in terms of the information we have about the plan, but we'll share some of the information that we have at this point with you all. So next slide, please, Beth. Okay, so we're going to start off with just a little bit of review from the last budget work session. So as usual, we start with the calendar to kind of show you all where we're at in the process. Internally, as we mentioned last time, we've really been working on the budget for about 5 or 6 months now. But we had our first work session, external focused work session with you all 2 weeks ago. We have the work session today. We have a third work session scheduled for April 13th. And in between that, you all will be talking about your priorities and doing some team building at your council retreat next week. And then finally, we'll roll into May with the presentation of the manager's recommended budget on May 25th, followed by a budget work session, public hearing and a potential budget work session on June 8th, and then adoption on June 22nd, which will keep us in compliance with state statute that requires us to adopt a balanced budget by June 30th of every year. So next slide, please. Okay, so just a little reminder of the things we talked about at our last budget work session. We spent a great deal of time going through the general fund and kind of looking at the current year financial status. And the message there was that in the general fund, at least, we have an improving outlook financially. Our sales taxes have held up really well. Our property taxes have done better than expected. Our expenses are in line with what we had budgeted for this year. But obviously, there's uncertainty moving forward. We're hopeful that we're through the worst of the pandemic and the economic recovery is going to continue, but there's definitely uncertainty that remains. We also spent some time talking about this year's budget process in particular and some of the things that we're doing differently this year with the budget process. And we mentioned that we're really focusing on current service levels and looking at those service levels through an equity lens. We talked a little bit about some of the work that we've done internally with departments. We had our consultants here who talked some about the external work and the community engagement work that's going on as well. And finally, we hit upon kind of 2 key topics for the budget process last time. One of those was revaluation and the potential changes, impacts that may have on the property tax rate. And then Peggy Rose shared some information with you all about employee compensation. And we talked about, some of the opportunities and challenges that both of those items present for the upcoming budget year. Next slide. And so just a reminder, I mentioned that the external community equity focused budget sessions that are going on, those have already started. The first one happened on March 18th. We have 2 more of those round 1 sessions coming up, one on March 24th at 6 o'clock, and then one on March 25th, a daytime session starting at 10. And those are with our consultants, and then they'll follow that up with 3 more round 2 sessions in April. And so those are the dates for those sessions, just to remind everyone of those. Okay, so first part of our presentation today, we're really going to talk about fees, and just want to kind of start off with a kind of a fee overview and talk about why we charge fees for particular services. And Beth, you can go on to the next slide if you'd like. So why charge for a service? So in some cases, the services that we provide really provide benefits to our entire community. And if you think of things like fire and police protection, they fit into that category. And so those types of services are primarily funded through our property tax. But there are certain services that we provide that really benefit specific customers. And in those cases, it makes more sense to charge a fee for those services. So you think of things like use of parking garages, parking meters, access to the nature center, going to see an event at the Civic Center. Those are the types of services in which we charge a fee for those. Another reason to charge a fee is that it ensures access. And a good example there, what we mean by that is with the parking garage. If you don't charge a fee, then there's potential that service or that area or that particular item would be completely used up. And so you use fees to ensure that there's access to those services. And then statutory requirements. So as you all probably know, there's certain services that we provide, and I think building code enforcement is a good example of that are statutorily required by either the state or the federal government. And so those types of statutorily required services that we provide, it makes more sense to provide or to charge a fee for those particular types of items, as opposed to having the property tax base absorb the cost of those. So what are some of the factors that we look at each year as we go through the budget process and we think about fees and think about changing those fees? Obviously, we look at the cost to provide the service, and we set the fees in many cases based on that cost to provide the service. And we think about something called a cost recovery level. In other words, do we want to set the fee at a level that recovers 100% of the cost of providing a service, or something less than 100%? And so that's a conversation we have as we're going through the budget process. We think about who benefits from the service, and we oftentimes engage outside consultants to help us with our rate setting and fee setting through fee studies. And in recent years, we've had fee studies done by outside consultants for fees in our development services area, parks and recreation, and then obviously water, which you all are going to hear a little bit more about later on. Okay, next slide. So you all saw this donut chart at the last work session, and this is our general fund and a breakdown of our general fund revenues. And the reason we included this chart again this time is just we want to kind of highlight the difference between the general fund revenue structure and our enterprise fund revenue structure. So if you remember from last time, property and sales taxes, as you can see, make up about 75 to 80% of the overall general fund revenue. There's that smaller slice up in the right-hand corner that we called other, and that's where our general fund fee revenue is. So things like fees from development services, solid waste, and parks are in that 27 million. But there are some other things in that category as well. So fees don't make up that full amount. But the overall message last time was that in the general fund, at least, property and sales taxes really are our bread and butter and our main revenue sources. Next slide. Okay, so we want to contrast that with our enterprise funds. And if you all remember from a few slides ago, I mentioned how enterprise funds really are set up for services that we provide that in some ways mimic private businesses. And so you can see that it's almost the exact opposite in the enterprise funds. Fees and charges make up about 75 to 80% of the total revenue in our enterprise funds. There's some smaller amounts from intergovernmental revenue, primarily in transit. And then there's also some of the enterprise funds, and you'll see a little bit more about this in a couple of slides, that are not fully supported by fees, examples being transit and civic center, in which the general fund has to provide some support. But overall, fees provide about 75, 80% of the total revenue in enterprise funds. Next slide. But like I said, we don't want to forget that in the general fund too, there are some fairly significant fee revenue sources. And we just wanted to highlight a few of those here. In particular, solid waste. There is a monthly solid waste fee that citizens pay on their water bills, and that generates about $5 million annually that goes to support the cost of that service. There's also fees in our development areas such as DSD, planning, and the Asheville Fire Department. And together, those fees provide about $3.8 million in revenue. And also in parks and recreation for things like the nature center, for classes, for athletics, those kinds of things. And those fees bring in about $1.5 million. And we mentioned these for a couple of reasons. One, again, these are some of our larger fees in the general fund. But these are also some fee areas that staff has submitted requests this year for changes. And we're currently evaluating those requests, and we'll be bringing more information forward to you all in the Finance Committee here in the coming weeks about potential changes to those fees in the upcoming fiscal year. One in particular we wanted to highlight is with the solid waste fee, that fee covers the cost of both our regular garbage collection as well as our recycling program. And we're expecting some pretty significant increases in recycling costs, contract costs moving forward into next fiscal year. And so we're evaluating whether we would want to include a fee increase to help offset some of those cost increases for recycling. Next slide. Well, like I mentioned, we want to primarily focus on the enterprise funds as we talk through fees. So these are a list of all of our enterprise funds. We have 6 of them. The largest by far is water resources, and we'll spend a little bit more time talking in depth about the water fees and the changes there. And these numbers out beside each of the enterprise funds represents the adopted budget for this year. So you can see water fund is by far and away the largest enterprise fund at $33 million. There's also stormwater and parking at about $6.6 million. Street cut is a smaller enterprise fund, just under $2 million budget. And then the other 2 enterprise funds we list below are ones that I mentioned that we do charge fees for, but the fees don't fully support the operation of those funds. So in the transit fund, it's about a $12 million budget this year. We do get significant revenue from federal and state grants, as well as support from the general fund and the parking fund to support that operation. And the same in the Harrah Center budget as well. It's about a $3.8 million budget, and there's about a $1 million transfer from the general fund to support operations there. But those funds at the top, as I mentioned, those are all fully supported by the fees that they charge their customers. Okay, next slide. So as we go through, we can stop and do questions for sure.
I just had one quick one, Tony. Thank you. The transit. So if I recall, it's 1.5 million from parking. How much is from the general fund? I don't know the breakup from the federal and state versus the general fund.
I think the general fund and Taylor may be able to check this and send me a number and I can share it with you. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 million. That's general fund support. It's gone up as transit has as it has expanded, and we've expanded service in the transit area over the last few years. We've primarily done that by funding it through the general fund, by increasing the general fund transfer.
Thank you.
Okay, so what we want to do with the next few slides is we're going to kind of walk through each of the enterprise funds, the smaller ones. We'll save water for our conversations with the consultants, but we want to kind of give you all, much like we did last week with the general fund, kind of a financial overview and kind of look at where things are at in each enterprise funds with a particular eye toward how COVID has impacted both the operations and the revenue side of each of our enterprise funds. And again, feel free to stop me and ask questions as we go along. We'll start with the Harrah's Cherokee Center Fund. And this is an operation that has been significantly impacted, obviously, by COVID. There's been no regular events scheduled at the center since March 13th of 2020. As you all know, there's been some basketball events there, but they haven't been, full tennis hasn't been allowed at those events. And so as a result, there's been significant impact on the revenue side of the budget in the Harrah Center. To date this year, through the first 8 months of the fiscal year, operating revenues are down about $2 million compared to where they were last year. The center's been able to manage its expense budget with fewer events. There's been fewer personnel costs, fewer costs around purchasing supplies such as beer and wine and alcohol for the events. And so they've been able to keep their costs down to help manage the reduction in revenue. And because of that, we've luckily been able to keep the general fund subsidy to the Harrah Center flat this fiscal year. We have done that by using some fund balance in the Harrah Center fund to help offset that lost revenue. But it's definitely been an impact there. We are, however, hopeful that there's going to be a return to some normalcy in terms of operating the Harrah Center next fiscal year. Right now, staff there is anticipating that events will start returning in September of 2021. So sometime around the end of the first quarter of next fiscal year. Next slide. So in our parking fund, obviously another operation that's been significantly impacted by COVID. Just as a reminder that we went through a period primarily last fiscal year where parking fees were not assessed. On-street or meter parking fees were not charged from March 15th to June 1st of last year. And off-street or garage revenues or fees were not charged from March 15th all the way through August 1st of this year. So there was some significant lost revenue when we weren't charging fees. And even though we've begun charging fees again, obviously demand has not returned to the levels that it was at prior to the pandemic. And so much like with the cellular center, with the Harrah Center, we have seen significant underperformance in terms of revenue through the first 8 months of the year in the parking fund. We were down about $2.2 million in terms of revenue compared to where we were last fiscal year at this time. One thing we did, we were anticipating revenues are going to be down, so we did lower the budget this year. We made some reductions on the operating side. We also reduced the amount of money that the parking fund puts into its capital program every year to try and offset that anticipated loss in revenue. So we're trying to manage the budget and stay within our existing resources there. But much like with the cellular or with the Harrah Center, old habits die hard. I'm sorry. Much like with the Harrah Center, we've been using fund balance in the parking fund there to offset some of the lower revenues that have been coming in. And one thing we did want to highlight kind of moving forward to next year and looking at the budget for the parking fund, there is a need to replace the gate equipment in the garages. It's old, it's antiquated, and needs to be replaced. And when that happens, there will likely be an adjustment that we have to make to fees as a part of that switching out of the equipment. Next slide. All right, and our transit fund, again, significant impacts there as a result of COVID. As you all know, we began operating fare-free soon after the pandemic started, and which has resulted in a loss of fare box revenue. To date, that's about $700,000 in fare box revenue that we've lost compared to what we would anticipate if we had been charging that fee. We've also, as you all know, because of social distancing, we've contracted for additional buses on certain routes, and that started in June of last year. And we expect that the expenses on additional buses, those supplemental buses through Young, to total about $2 million by the end of this fiscal year. So again, significant impact on both the revenue and the expense side of the transit budget because of COVID. Luckily, we have received CARES Act money through the first round of stimulus dollars to help offset some of that impact. We got about $3.68 million to date, and it has been at this point, fully utilized to cover the additional expenses and lost revenue that we've seen to date. We have, luckily, the CARES Act money helped us get through a loss of revenue from the state as well. You all may remember that what's called the SMAP funding from the state was withheld this fiscal year. The state let us know very near the end of the budget process that we wouldn't be receiving that money this year. And that was a loss of about $1.1 million, which again, we've offset with some CARES Act funding. So I'll stop. I see Councilmember Roney has a question.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to name that another way to look at this could be that approximately $700,000 in fares are instead being spent in other ways in our community because we didn't create a barrier to entry by requiring a fare.
Thank you. And I did get back to Councilmember Turner's question. So the amount of the general fund subsidy to transit this year is about $6.8 million. So, and then the last thing I would say on this slide, again, kind of looking forward to next year's budget and potential cost increases. We are looking at a kind of an annual increase in the contract costs that we have with RETP Dev to provide the service. And so that would be a contract cost increase exclusive of any kind of expansion of service or anything like that. All right, next slide. All right, Stormwater Fund. So again, another one of our enterprise funds that charges a fee. It's fully supported by fees. And one of the things a couple of things we wanted to highlight here. One is that typically each year we do a 5% increase in stormwater fees to keep up with the cost of providing service, to begin or to continue to provide money toward capital needs in that fund. We did not pass or increase that fee this year because of the impact of COVID. And so that fund has been operating this year with no fee increase. And what that means is that over time, the current financial capacity in this fund will be inadequate to address the maintenance needs that are out there. And so we're really going to have to look at beginning to implement regular increases in the fees and this fund again moving forward, specifically to fund things on the capital side. And we may have to look at beginning a debt service program to fund some of those capital items as well. Next slide. So just a quick summary, and then I'll stop and let you all ask any questions that you may have. So kind of an impact or a reminder of the impacts that COVID has had on the enterprise funds. Again, in the Harrah Center, we've seen substantial revenue loss. Revenues are down about $2 million through the first 8 months of this fiscal year. Same thing in the parking fund. Revenues are down in that fund by about $2.2 million through the first 8 months. We've had loss of fare box revenue in the transit fund, additional expenses of about $2 million for the supplemental service. And one thing we are doing is obviously with the American Rescue Plan, one of the provisions in that bill is that it will allow local governments to apply some of that money toward revenue that's been lost because of the pandemic. And so as we move forward over the next few months, we'll be reviewing opportunities that we have with those dollars to make up some of the lost revenue that we have seen in these enterprise funds over the last 12 months or so. All right, next slide. I think this is where we pause and see if you all have any questions.
I have a question. I'm not sure if this will be best for you or Jessica. It's a broader question about ridership on the bus. So we're still limiting to 10 to the young buses or the supplemental behind it. We're looking at an additional $2 million. Do we have any idea of when more riders, it might be safe for more riders to be on the bus?
Hi, this is Jessica. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Jessica.
That's a great question. And I don't have a great answer for it. I think as long as we have social distancing standards in place to some extent, then we will be limiting capacity. So we are, following the state's lead and the county's lead. And I would expect that as long as there's capacity restrictions in, things like restaurants and retail, that we will be applying that line of thinking to our buses as well.
Thank you, Jessica. I wondered.
Mm-hmm.
I see Councilmember Roney has a question.
Thank you. So I have two questions. One is, because I know that we've been doing the supplemental service through Young's, which is an important part of maintaining our core city service of transit. How many of those have had to be runs to the South Asheville routes for S3 and S6? The reason I'm asking this is because if we had implemented fiscal year 2 of the South Asheville service, would we have needed Young's because the impact of having duplicate service? So what I really need to know is how many trips of Young's have been required to South Asheville? And then the second part is liquidated damages. We switched to a new contract, which was significantly more expensive. But have we been paying for routes during the pandemic and during this fiscal cycle that we haven't run?
So to your first question, we have been running the Young buses on 4 routes, and those include, hopefully I get this right, the WE1, the WE2, S3, and S5 primarily. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, when we had several of the RATP drivers out, there were some instances where we may have had some other routes filled, but I would say for about the last 7 or so months, it's strictly been on those 4 routes. So we have not had any on the S6 that I'm aware of, but the S3 we have. And the second part of your question, as to liquidated damages, So if a trip is not made by RATP Dev, then we don't pay for that trip. If they miss a trip because of like a breakdown, so in other words, if they fully intended to or were scheduled to make a trip but couldn't because there was a breakdown or some other issue, then that would be not only a missed trip but also a liquidated damage. And so we've been applying those consistently throughout the contract.
Thank you, Jessica. Is it possible for us to get a report on how many missed trips we've had, either due to like a breakdown of equipment, a failure, or maybe it was a fleet issue, or maybe it was not having enough staff, but also just a general report on how many routes have been missed?
Yes, we can do that for you.
Thank you.
Just a quick reminder, we are currently operating a route outside of the city limits, and we are not being reimbursed for the full cost of that. I'd like to see that addressed, either we get the funding from the county or the city of Black Mountain or someplace else, or we discontinue that service outside the city limits. So just wanted to put that out there again, that this is an issue.
I'll kind of add on to that comment in that I was thinking about the change in the paratransit and things that were changing with the county. And now that we know some of this Recovery Act dollars are coming into the community, and the county is too, I wonder if we're talking to them about joining forces again. I know they got a pretty big pool, and it sounds like we're going to take a pretty hard hit from this one, more so than they are.
While we're also getting a report on maintenance of service, is it possible to see the numbers on how much service has been lost to North Asheville since we cut the weekend service hours to UNCA?
Yes, we can do that. When we were weighing the decision of whether or not to suspend that weekend service, and again, that's late night service on Friday nights and Saturday nights on the N1 route, we looked at past ridership numbers and concluded that there were, I think, an average of somewhere between 2 and 8 people, I think, each trip. And so the Multimodal Commission voted to support suspending that service until at least the next school year starts. And that at that point, we would revisit with UNCA whether or not they were prepared to fund that service. So we can provide you with the information that was used to generate that decision.
Thank you. I know that'll be important as we look at evening service hours for all of the city, especially considering that these routes offer service to all of North Asheville up to Beaver Lake, not just to the school.
Right.
Great. Any additional questions before we move on to the next section? Okay. Beth, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to spend the next part of the presentation talking about the Water Resources Fund, and I'll kind of kick things off, and then I'll turn it over to our consultants from DEC to give you all some more detail on where we're at with water rates. So next slide, Beth. So just a reminder that the Water Resources Fund is our largest enterprise fund. It's our largest single department at a budget of about $33 million. The fund has substantial capital and operating costs, capital costs to maintain the infrastructure, the water lines, the water treatment plants, all of those things. And as a result of the size of the fund and the ongoing needs to maintain the system, and also the fact that we do have significant debt that we've issued along the way to help fund some of our capital projects, we employ some outside consultants, folks from DEC, folks also from a group called Raftalis out of Charlotte that helps develop our rate model for us to make sure that over time we're bringing in enough money to support capital, to support operations, to pay our debt, to meet our debt service coverage obligations, which is something that our rating agencies look at. They provide a separate rating for our water debt that we issue, and so we want to make sure that our rates are sufficient to cover those debt coverage ratios and maintain our debt ratings in the water fund. So next slide, Beth. So just a little background. So in 2018, the North Carolina Supreme Court issued an opinion that has impacted water systems and sewer systems throughout the state. And what that opinion said was that local governments, cities, are not permitted to charge what's called water and sewer impact fees. And so once that ruling was handed down, there began to be a number of lawsuits across the state where law firms were filing these lawsuits against cities in North Carolina that have been charging fees that were similar to impact fees over the last few years. And so Asheville was not immune to that. And so if you go to the next slide, Beth, Asheville was sued in 2 class action lawsuits based on around our capital improvement fee that we charge or were charging. And so the capital improvement fee was it's a charge that was based on the size of a meter. And so every customer paid it, all residential customers, all commercial customers. And again, it was based on the size of the meter. So the larger the meter size, the higher the fee was that a customer was charged. And so what happened was we settled these lawsuits without admission of liability on the city's part. But the settlement that we agreed to did include an agreement that we would discontinue charging the capital improvement fee. And so that happened on July 1. We discontinued the fee July 1 of this fiscal year, July 1 of 2020. So we haven't been charging the fee for about 9 months or so. And so what that means for the water fund is that's a loss of about $7.5 million. And that revenue, as the name of the fee implied, that revenue went directly into supporting the water capital program and the debt service associated with that program. So what we agreed to at the time, once we realized that we were going to lose the ability to charge this fee, was that we would begin working with our financial and rate consultants to develop a plan to begin recovering that revenue over time and do it in such a way that it would not burden customers with trying to get all the revenue back in one particular fiscal year. So Beth, if you go to the next slide. Okay, so I think this is where I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Doug Carter from DEC and Associates, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the financial planning that goes into water rate setting and why we're here to talk to you all about it today.
Thank you, Tony. Mayor and members of City Council and City Manager, thank you for giving us a short period of time to talk about financial planning and rate setting, especially in terms of the time period we're in and looking at realigning rates. So let's go to the next slide, please, Beth. I just want to take a short time period to talk to you a bit about the city's financial planning, what makes for good financial planning, and then the city's history on that. So I'll do this relatively quickly, but obviously we'll answer questions as you would like to know. The city has done multi-year operating and budget projections for some time now, looking at what will happen down the road. It has established fund balance and liquidity retention policies to make sure that there was adequate resources to meet times like we've just gone through, which the COVID and the uncertainties that it brought. It has a comprehensive CIP, a really good set of debt policies which govern the issuance of debt by the city and its various credit entities. I think in a larger sense, though, there's been this strong emphasis on keeping flexibility to meet service demand changes, and then what happens when you manage both in good and not so good times. And then because of Asheville's growth and emergence as a major regional city, and not only in North Carolina, but in the South, a focus on growth and the need for adjustments as they come, both in operations and for capital. And then today, our primary subject will be about Asheville Water and how it has managed and equipped itself from a capital program perspective. So what is the city's history on these important elements of financial planning? Well, you've been into multi-year planning for a number of years. As I said earlier, you have fund policies. You have a multi-year CIP that shows us both borrowed and pay-as-you-go sources so as to diversify the capital program. You've used very appropriate and cost-efficient forms of debt to lower the overall cost of how you borrow. And you've also focused not only means to manage the capital program in a larger sense, but have also looked at a dedicated investment funds or dedicated funds in order to pay for your CIP, IP, and debt service. And then obviously, as Tony mentioned earlier, we're dealing with a court order change throughout the state and how fees are collected, and how we deal with that is an important thing to look at today, and the mandate that brought about. I'll say one other thing before we go to the next slide. Perhaps one of the most easy to see and read about and look at the history of a third party looking at the city and looking at how well you do financial planning is by looking at your ratings and how they have changed over the years. Rating agencies, as you know, work for the bondholders, not for you. So their eye is very specific on how well you manage to pay your debt. You are, in your general credit, a AAA credit rating. You got the first one in 2015, and then onward a couple of years later, you got your second rating at that point. And that just provides a really sound means to look at from a third-party source how you do your planning and how you've managed it over time. There were a series of rating upgrades to have you come to the highest category with some pretty hard work. I will say this, there are few AAA rated cities. There are more in North Carolina than anywhere else in the country, and you are part of that limited group, even in North Carolina, that has the highest credit standards. So Beth, let's go to the next slide, please. I want to talk just a little bit about fairness and revenue adequacy of your water user fees, and then move more towards our thoughts about how you're looking at your realignment in fees. Obviously, you have to have an emphasis on the fixed and variable components of the fee system and how those components are spread among the customer types, residential, commercial, and others. With a real emphasis towards, do the rates fairly distribute the charges between fixed and variable components? Affordability for users, especially at low residential consumption, has been a real focus of your water system and many others in the state over the years, and looking at how are rates charged both on the fixed and the variable side. The other thing that is often looked at is how the distribution of your fees between your customer types, the reasonableness of them, and how do they compare to other water systems? Are we splitting the revenues between the commercial and the residential side in a sound way? And then finally, as is done by any other city that looks at their rates, they look at yours and many others that they consider to be peer systems and say, overall, how do we compare from a water rate perspective? Next slide, please. The second feature to look at between the rate structure themselves and how it's split between fixed and variable and the various customer types is what is the adequacy of the revenues that are produced from these user fees. It's important to note from you, and Tony mentioned this earlier, you have a separate credit rating for your water system. And that credit rating is a water system revenue bond. And so essentially that revenue bond or that repayment of debt is done solely off of the revenues produced from the system. There's no requirement for input from the taxpayer or anyone else. It's purely system revenues. And so that makes for an important reason to look at rates, your revenues and the rates, and how they are operating inside a set of credit metrics. And I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about that in the next slide. So first and foremost, are the total fees collected adequate to do operations as well as capital needs? And unfortunately, for many systems in the past, often capital has had to be delayed. I will say from your circumstance and looking at the city of Asheville and in the past time periods, I think y'all have done a really good job in looking at the long-term capital needs, the uniqueness of a water system that operates in the mountains compared to one that operates on flatter ground, and how that cost and capital need is defined by your location, your customer base, and so forth. Secondly, are your revenues sufficient to provide you proper cash position and fund equity? Because here again, the system operates entirely off its own revenues, and the ability for it to pay in times that we have for extraordinary change is important to have adequate cash and fund equity. Third is, do the rates provide not only for the operating cost, but sufficient funds to pay debt service and also to provide some pay-as-you-go means to acquire your capital? And then fourth, I would say to you, the city has maintained for many years a comprehensive debt model that looks at affordability of your rates, how rapidly you can issue debt underneath your revenue bond and how it works. And I just will say to you that you've done that longer than many other cities that are much larger than you are. And then finally, as a revenue bond issuer, there are covenants inside your revenue bond issuance on maintenance of revenues, what are minimums, things of that nature. And so therefore, looking at the FY22 rate structure and how it will have to be restructured or reoriented because of the court case is really important. Beth, we can go next. I just wanted to do this rapidly, especially for those that may not have looked at this for a while, in talking about what a revenue bond or how it's looked at and rated. You are rated by 2 rating agencies for your water revenue bonds, and you are rated AA1 and AA+, which is the highest rating that you can have for a high AA credit. Essentially, that's all but a AAA. It's the highest you can get before moving there. You price very efficiently when you sell bonds, and so I feel really good at that because of the high ratings. If you look at Moody's, which is sort of the left side of the page, the number one name you tend to see on rating pages, if you look at them, they have 4 areas that they look at in terms of rating you, especially as high as you are rated. First is characteristics of the system, its financial strength, as you can well see, the largest single category, how it's managed, and then finally, how do the legal provisions inside the bond documents look? Are they adequate, and so forth. The system characteristics is the one that you control probably the least because it's based primarily on wealth levels in the community, ability to pay, and also size of the system. For the financial strength and management side, which combined is 60% of the rating, they look at sound and consistent rate setting. How have you maintained rate setting over the years? Are they consistent? Are they diverse? Can they meet good times and bad times? They look at debt service coverage and how you meet your own policies for debt service coverage. They look at what we've all kind of looked at in any rating of a business-oriented type of operation as this enterprise is. How many days cash on hand do you have? How long can you float the system if you have a revenue problem? And then finally, I would just say, why would we want to work for highest ratings, especially now as we are looking at rates and so forth? First, it's lower interest cost. And you also have greatest flexibility as rated highly in how you do your issuances. It allows you to creatively structure your debt repayment because people have strong feelings about your ability to repay them. And then to me, the biggest, almost more than the other two, and this probably sounds counterintuitive, but the greatest access to financial markets. Many of us remember 2008, the problems in COVID, because in the early days of COVID, financial markets were very tough. And so really to be highly rated, in many respects, the most important thing is it gives you the greatest access to get to people who will loan you their money that you need to borrow. So, last slide. So I just want to summarize, and then of course I'm available to you as need be for questions. I believe how at least our working group has been looking at the realignment recommendations that will be coming to council on the rates due to the external circumstances that we've had to deal with are sound. We work with Raftalis, who Tony mentioned earlier. They're one of the top firms that do rate structures and how rates work. They work heavily with the city on their affordability analysis. We think the realignment as we see it now retains fairness and comparability to your peer utilities. We think the future revenues, and you'll see a little bit of them in another slide or two, that those estimated future revenues would permit system expansion at the levels that are currently anticipated in order to keep the asset base growing and the age and upkeep of your system going. We think that that will be permitted and that that is adequate under this system. And we believe that the rate change will give you an ability in the 5-year planning cycle to forecast cycles, the future 5 years, to manage the system in the way that you've anticipated. And then in a larger sense, provide a sound informational discussion with rating analysts as we issue our next bond issue, which will be coming in the next few months, actually, in order for them to understand how the city is managing through an external financial situation that it didn't ask for, but that it must deal with, how it is doing that, and how it sees itself continuing as a very strong credit entity and therefore will retain its ratings. I think our challenge is to say, here are the rates as they're being looked at. We're looking at a 4 to 5 year time period for recovery of total revenues. We know we should not do that in 1 year alone. And so I think that's our challenge, to describe where we are, how we're planning, what we're doing. And so with that.
All right. Well, thank you, Doug. Thank you very much. We have a couple more slides to wrap up this section, and then happy to answer. I can answer any questions you all may have, or Doug can answer any questions as well. So just to kind of summarize, again, we've talked a lot in theory and concept about where we want to go with the rates. So here's a chart that shows the impact that the rate realignment, the rate structure that we're proposing would have on the average residential customer over the next 5 years. And so we wanted to start with the year before the year we're in now. We want to start with fiscal year 20. And so that was the last year that we were able to charge the capital improvement fee. And so what happened when that fee went away this year was folks actually saw a decrease in their bills. And so the average user saw their bill go down by about $8.50 in the current year. And so you can see the proposed rates that we are looking at over the next 5 years, going back, coming up in the future. You can see that first year that we're looking at, the rate adjustments that we're proposing for council to adopt for next fiscal year would bring the average residential user bill back up to $63.42. So it would be an increase compared to what they're paying this year, but would actually still be lower than the rate that they were paying 2 years ago before the CIP fee went away. And so that's kind of what we were talking about in terms of easing back into the charges and recovering the revenue over time. And then the final row at the bottom, again, we want to kind of highlight that we're, what Doug said, that we're not getting all the revenue back in 1 year. You can see in FY20, the last year that we charged the fee, revenue in the water fund was about $41.1 million. And then we really don't get back to that level of revenue in the water fund with the fee adjustments even until FY25. So just in summary, the next slide, Beth, and then we'll pause and let you all ask any questions. And so the rate realignment that we're proposing, that we worked with DEC and Raft Hallis to come up with over the last several months, meets the legal requirements of the lawsuits and the settlements. As I said, it eases us into revenue recovery over time to lessen the burden on customers. And it provides sufficient resources to meet those operating and capital needs as we move into the future, and also meet the debt rating agency debt coverage ratios that they look at when they're assigning City of Asheville debt ratings and the cost of borrowing. So I think the next slide is the questions slide. So we'll pause there. And like I said, happy to answer any questions you all might have.
Tony, it's Gwen. Thank you for this. Maybe I missed it, and maybe I don't even remember where we are in the cycle, but we went through a period of time where we were adjusting commercial rates up because we had studied and determined that our commercial rates were not equitable compared to our residential rates. Where are we in that cycle, and relative to this new proposal, how is it going to affect commercial rates? And the third question I have is, it's not 100% clear to me why we wouldn't recover the entire, basically get back the entire reduction from last year next year.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thanks for the question. And I forgot to mention, I think David Melton is on the meeting as well. And so he may have to help me out with some of the questions. Hopefully David is there. But you're right. We were, prior to the pandemic, when we were doing regular annual rate increases, those rate increases were designed to change or alter or narrow the gap between the rates and the fees that were being charged to commercial users, particularly large commercial users, and residential users. And so, yeah, we were all the rate adjustments that we did in the 3 to 4 or 5 years before the pandemic were designed and did narrow the gap between the charges between those classes of customers. And David, I don't know if you're on the call and would want to elaborate on that at all.
No, I think that's completely accurate, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. And the new rate structure is based on industry standards for flows of meters. So it's equitable across the board, basically on the amount of water that you can receive, if that makes sense. So if you've got a larger meter, you're going to pay a higher price. So that kind of smooths it out and makes it more equitable across the board.
Okay, and then I guess Gwen, if I forget one of your questions, I think the next question you asked was why not go for full cost recovery or full revenue recovery next year? And again, happy to have David or Doug weigh in on that as well. And I think it really goes back to what we talked about with, given the circumstances we're in economically and not wanting to fully burden residents and residential and commercial users with trying to recover all that revenue in 1 year. Obviously, a lot of folks have been struggling because of the pandemic to pay bills. With tourism being down, there's been struggles on the commercial side as well. And so we just try to be mindful of that as we're looking into the rate realignment and the rates that we're proposing for next fiscal year in particular.
Well, I acknowledge that, but at the same time, we didn't decrease any other fees or typically last year, and we did, we basically did reduce fees by $8 or $6, whatever the number, $6.42 or something. So, I mean, it just feels like, you just basically be restoring it. It's not as if you're really increasing it. But I mean, that's your.
Tony, I think that Kim had a question. I believe Kim, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I think it works with what Gwen's talking about, and I appreciate your questions, Gwen. So I see the data based on average user, what other categories of users are there in addition to residential and commercial? So are there differentials due to bulk use compared to residential use?
There is. We have primarily residential users. Then we have commercial users, industrial, and wholesale. We wholesale to 3 other entities. So the rates are set up so they're equal for the types, kind of as Doug was alluding to. So, and a lot of that is per Sullivan. All the residential customers are treated the same, and every other customer class is treated the same within their class, if that makes sense. But that's our base of our users, yes.
So what's the percentage of users, like what percentage of users are residential?
Just to clarify on this question, there is a difference between the number of accounts. So like, do you have how many accounts and the actual usage. So are you asking like, how much water do all residential users use of the whole, or how many customers do they make up of the whole?
Both.
From our residential class, that is where the bulk of our usage goes. And I could kind of take a stab at it and say we're probably 75% residential, but I can get those numbers together. Then the rest would be mainly commercial. We don't have a whole lot of industrial users. We do have a few, and hopefully we'll get more in the future with more industry coming to our area. Then we have on the wholesale side, we have 3 users on the wholesale side.
Okay, so that informs like the next series of questions, which is, what is the measurement and basis for bulk rating? Like how much water would have to be used to meet that bulk capacity? And then what would the impact on our system characteristics be? Because earlier it was named as like a wealth level.
As far as bulk, do you mean like wholesale rates?
Right.
And that's the only rate we have for other, our users are the town of Black Mountain, the town of Biltmore Forest, and the town of Woodfin. So it's a government entity basically that gets that wholesale rate. As far as bulk rates, we don't have that. It's, I guess the difference is a good way to put it. I'm trying to figure this, how to say this, but I think if you look at usage on an individual basis, that's a good way to look at it, because a commercial application like a restaurant is obviously going to use more water than a residential customer. So that's the way it's classed. Then an individual industrial customer would typically use more than an individual commercial customer. So there's not really bulk rates, but it is based on their usage and, of course, how much water they can obtain from the system at any given time.
So I guess the thing that's missing is when the presentation says average, what does the typical or average residential customer pay per gallon compared to what a laundry service at a hotel pay per gallon? That's like the spirit of where I'm headed with this, is when we have this bulk rate, then is it up to the government entity, like in this case, the city of Asheville, or the Metropolitan Sewers District to set wholesale rates or commercial rates?
So in the past, we have been able to see a rate sheet, and it will show us the usage rate by customer class. And so I know we have that somewhere.
That'd be great.
And maybe it's available. And we've even done pretty deep dives in the past to make sure our various rate categories were kind of in line with the norm for pricing. When you compare it across systems, like what's the city of Raleigh charging for water, that kind of thing. So I think that's kind of what you're asking to look at, information like that. Can that be provided? I'm assuming that's not too difficult.
It's available. It's available online. I was able to Google it really quickly. It goes down to irrigation, manufacturing per cubic feet. I mean, there's a long list. I'll send the link to y'all.
Well, and staff can send it, and normally, I know we're doing this budget work session. Normally rates in general make their way through finance subcommittee, and they do take a look at each of those categories. And so when there was a discussion about adjusting our commercial rates in the past, it was, to that point, we realized our commercial rates were too low relative to our residential rates. And too much of our revenue is coming from residential customers versus commercial customers. So that's been several years of adjustments. Gwen, you got your hand. There's some hands up. Gwen and Sage.
I do. It's very exciting to use this little function. For the finance committee meeting and then, ultimately for city council, can you just give us a little bit of history of what our rates look like, over a 10-year period, but also compare that to what MSD did? Because it seems like MSD kind of continuous every year increases their rates. And I'm just curious, more from the standpoint of our citizens. I'm not sure they fully distinguish that the city of Asheville earns the money off the water, and then MSD is a separate entity because we bill for both of them. So I'd just be interested to see kind of what we were doing rate wise. And then it gets complicated because we charge kind of a base fee and then a fee for usage, right? So I don't know how you can present that, but somehow if we can, that'd be great.
There's no more hands, right? Oh no, Sage has a
I
question.
was just going to share a comment. I was actually glad to see that it wasn't such a large impact. I appreciate the way that you all have modeled this return. And, when I think about coming out of COVID and recovery in general, I think it's going to be hard for us as a body to raise any taxes or even think about raising fees to customers. But then I think about all the water issues we've had and the brown water, and it wasn't that long ago that we were in a constant state of water chaos. So in general, I'm supportive of us returning to a system that allows us to get on track with our water infrastructure. I just wanted to share some kudos for the work done so far and the longer term look. Thank you.
Well, and thank you all. And I know Beth has been working to try and get a finance committee meeting scheduled, I think, for early April, and we can certainly provide additional information and detail at that meeting and at any subsequent city council meetings where we discuss the water rates. So any other questions on water, or you all want to move forward to the final part of our presentation today?
Tony, the only thing that I would like to add is I really appreciate this kind of drill down on water and water rates and so forth. But, when we were looking at these fees and how to recover the impact of a loss of 7.5 million, and in particular, looking at our water customer, we certainly didn't want to look at this in isolation because this is only one enterprise account. There may be increases in parking. There may be so we really tried to look at across the board at the number of other fees that may be increased to think about the cumulative effect of increasing fees and not just we kind of looked at them on an individual basis, but also being very, very cognizant of the cumulative impact of the increases. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Doug and David, for being there to help answer some questions. Thank you all very much. So moving on to the final part of our presentation today, and this will be brief, primarily because we're really in the early stages of learning about the American Rescue Plan and learning the details of it. And so we have a couple slides on it, maybe even just one slide, but we're really awaiting guidance from the U.S. Department of Treasury about the specifics around what the money can be used for. There was a webinar this morning that the North Carolina League of Municipalities presented, and there were folks from the National League of Cities there to talk about guidance, and folks are really preaching patience right now as we wait to get additional information from the federal government about what we can use those dollars on. Right now, it does look like we're going to get about $26 million directly allocated to the city of Asheville. That was one of the things that was mentioned this morning on the call, was that the Department of Treasury is still refining those numbers. And so those numbers are not exact right now. They may change for some local governments. The way the system is set up, or is planned to be set up right now, is that we'll receive those payments or that allocation in two payments. The first would be within 60 days of when the law was signed, and the second half of the money would come 1 year later. And so that's much different than most prior federal government dollars that we've received, especially for COVID. It's usually reimbursement based, where you have to spend the money first and then you receive reimbursement, but we're actually going to be receiving the cash for this plan upfront. And the current deadline for having used those dollars is December 31st, 2024. I heard on the call last week that deadline might possibly be changed, but that's the deadline currently. And I heard on the call this morning that we're still trying to get clarification on whether it means fully spent or obligated or encumbered. So again, a lot of questions still really need to be answered around these dollars and what they can be used for. So next slide, Beth. So again, just to finish up, the key takeaways that we started with about, an hour and 15 minutes ago or so were the adverse impact that the pandemic has had on our enterprise funds. We highlighted in Harrah's Cherokee Center, in the transit fund and parking, some of the impacts on both the operating and revenue side of the budget. We talked a lot about the fees and the fee changes that we're looking at currently, particularly the water fee realignment. And lastly, we just talked a little bit about the American Rescue Plan. But again, those are the key takeaways we wanted to leave you all in the community with this particular budget work session. So next slide, Beth. So looking ahead to the next set of work sessions and dates, we do have a work session scheduled for April 13th. We anticipate that work session being focused, at least the first part, on our capital improvement program. We haven't talked a whole lot or any really so far about our CIP, so we'll present some information around that at that work session. And then we'll continue our review of the operating budget as well, probably in the second half of that next work session. But we're still working to refine the agenda for the April 13th session. We do anticipate, right now, we would like to bring any fee changes that we're proposing to City Council for approval at their last meeting in April. That's assuming we have those, we can schedule the Finance Committee meeting for early April and have that group look at the fees first. But we'd like to bring you all the fees at the end of April. We typically do that where we bring the fees to council for adoption prior to bringing you all the budget. That way we know that if the fees are approved, and even though you all would approve the fees in April, they wouldn't go into effect until July 1st. But that allows us to know that we're going to get that additional revenue and count on that revenue as we're finalizing the manager's recommended budget. So we'll hopefully be bringing you all those fees for your consideration on April 27th. And then we're also considering a potential additional work session after the April 13th one that would kind of be a wrap-up session almost, where we would get final input from you all before we go back and begin putting the final touches on the manager's recommended budget, which we'll be bringing you all on May 25th. So I think there's one more slide. I think we did want to remind folks again about the external equity-focused budget sessions that are going on. A couple coming up in the next week, and then those round 2 sessions that are scheduled for April as well. So I think that is the last slide. So again, be happy to answer any questions about the last section or any of the other topics that we have covered today. So thank you very much.
So Mayor, before you conclude, I just wanted to again say thank you all. This has been a tough day for you. You started out very early, and you've been very focused, and we've just been giving a lot of information that you have processed. And you can tell that obviously from the kinds of questions that you all asked. So just again, wanted to say thank you to staff as well, and to the consultants, and appreciate you, and see you like in an hour to move to the council meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Deborah, and thanks to the staff for putting that together and providing that information into the consultant on the water issues. We appreciate it. So this is a test of your endurance today to see if you can make it all the way through, everyone. Get hydrated, take a break, and we'll be back here at 5 o'clock to continue meeting. All right. Thanks.